We're live. It is Friday, August 14th, 2020, 5 o'clock p.m. We are online. We are on time today and online. Uh, it is a cabin in the woods day. It is a blueberry wine day. For our guest, it is a Peloton day. And I just want to tell you the story of how we got this guest. It's the true professionalism of In Lieu of Fun, how it works here. Uh, I tweeted at Nate Silver this morning and told him he should come on and talk about his model because we had Elliot Morris on, and Elliot Morris did the "my model can beat up your model" thing, and uh, 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 I thought Nate would come on and do the "no, your model's mother wears combat boots" thing, but instead Nate did not respond to me, which was not good of him. But our guest, Natalie Jackson, did respond and said, "Hey, if you want another view of these models, check this out." And she sent this very interesting article that reflected a certain skepticism of election models. And then Elliot Morris tweeted, "You really should have Natalie on to talk about this." And so I sent her a note that said, "Why don't you come on and talk about this?" And she said, "Great." So here she is. Welcome to In Lieu of Fun. We are not allowed to have fun anymore, but in lieu of fun, we are allowed to have pollsters who are skeptical of models. So let us introduce you. Um, First of all, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So, Natalie Jackson is a pollster. I guess you are the second pollster after Claudia Dean that we have had on the show. She is the director of research at something called the PRRI. And let's start with, what is the PRRI?
So PRRI is Public Religion Research Institute. We do policy research, public opinion research, kind of at the intersection of religion, culture, and society. There are kind of three basic cleavages in society these days, and one of them is religion. The other two are race and politics, of course. Um, but we work on policy issues. We do high quality public opinion polling, and I am in charge of our research operation, which is basically making sure that research happens.
And and so what kind of polling do you do? Do you do election polling?
We do not do election polling. We do policy issues only. Um, and we work primarily, some of our issue areas, we do a lot of work on LGBT rights, um, immigration, white supremacy, and racism issues, things like that. We tend to avoid the horse race. It's an oversaturated area anyway.
Indeed, it's something that a lot of other people are putting a lot of work into. And yet, you have views on the subject of election forecasting. So let's talk about that. Why are you skeptical of the entire endeavor? And, and how deep is the skepticism?
Well, so my background is prior to where I work now, I worked at the Huffington Post. And so I was the person who created the model in 2016 that said Hillary Clinton would have a 98% chance of winning the election on election day. I wrote that model. That's still kind of a hard thing to say because it's been a lot of time to think, a lot of feedback, to put it kindly. on that sort of enterprise. I was practically run off the internet for a while right after the election. The harassment was really, really bad. But in thinking through what forecast models do and what the purpose of them is, you know, one of the attacks that people were lobbing at me was that I was responsible for Trump being elected. Me personally, my model.
And what was, you know, so people blame me for Bill Barr, so I'm sympathetic to this concern. Um, uh, but I want to understand the logics to the extent that there is any of that criticism. Is the idea that because you had that model, people were lulled into a false sense of security and didn't vote? What was the theory in which you personally are responsible for Donald
And
Trump?
what about all the other models that had similar things that said, you know, that there was more than likely to happen, very likely to happen, that Hillary is going to win? Did they get blamed too?
It seemed to be less intense for other people. I will note that I was the only female out there with a forecast. I do think that mattered in the reaction. The other model that was so extreme, Sam Wang, Princeton Election Consortium, had 99%. He had promised to eat a bug if Trump won, and so he ended up eating a bug on CNN. So I don't know fully how to compare that to what I had.
But like yeah.
And
Anyways,
yet,
I don't
even
think he got
after he ate
dragged
the
in the
bug,
same way you did.
I just want to say, even after he ate the bug, Trump was still president. So like, it's not. But I'm having I have a hard time with the idea that any of the predictive models are remotely responsible for the outcome any more than a poll that is within the margin of, you know, if the poll is outside the margin of error, you can say, well, what's wrong with the poll? If the poll is inside the margin of error, but it's not causal, and so I'm
But
having
people
trouble
don't
with.
This is like, I mean, not to like, I want her to answer what she thinks, but I'm going to also just add, like, this is one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to Natalie, is because I don't really buy the forecasting models at all. They seem to like prey on people's worst cognitive biases for past results dictating future results, causality, and like all types of other issues. And it doesn't, like, I don't care how great your model is or how much ML you use. There's just a certain amount that, like, you can't predict the future. And that reporting that you can predict the future in some type of way is going to maybe have some type of recursive effect on people's behavior in how they like act in the future. So, like, for instance, exit polling. Anyways, Natalie, do you agree?
Yeah, so exactly what you said. So there's been some research since 2016. There's a really good paper. It's by Westwood, Messing, and Welts, where they actually researched this. And what they found was that people are much worse at assessing the reality of a probabilistic number, like a 98% or a 72%, than they are even a polling number. If you say 55 to 45, people are like, oh, okay, that could probably go either way, even though the chances are it's probably not going to go either way. If you put a probability on that 55-45, that's where you get 80-90% likely, and suddenly people's minds are like, oh, that's going to happen. So that's kind of the phenomenon. People are much worse, and there's a whole tradition of research that shows this. People are just not great at interpreting a probability. And there is also some evidence that they might stay home. The other effect is that if you have Nate Silver out there saying this person is going to win the election, how does that factor into what the New York Times does? How does that factor into what the Washington Post does? The bigger picture is how do those people who are making editorial decisions view this, and how does that consciously or subconsciously frame their decision making at kind of the elite level?
So I have another question about the aggregate enterprise of modeling the election, which is whether it's expressing the likelihood with radically the wrong number of significant figures. So, I learned I forget whether it was high school chemistry or, that it is important to express things with the minimum number of significant figures that your inputs have. And which is another way of saying that faux precision is a form of inaccuracy. And when I look at the 538 prediction, that like at the level of a 72% likelihood of a Biden win, that seems to me to be more precise than our measurement indexes, than our measurement inputs could possibly allow. Now, I know how it gets to it, which is that, you have a whole lot of data and you crunch those numbers and it spits out a number and you express the number that you, that it articulates. And yet I react to it a little bit like, say, 72% is really a way of saying pretty likely. And I'm wondering if it's not necessarily a methodological error in the data crunching or collection or the design of the model, but a methodological immodesty in the way the result is presented. What do you think?
That's definitely one of the issues, and this is what I write about in the article that I sent you on Twitter. These models become so complex, and really that 72% is not the number that the model spit out. That's the average of thousands and thousands of simulations. And so when we say 72% likely, behind it, there's all of this simulating and really complex math that you need a graduate degree in statistics to kind of get. And there's no way people can understand that. There's no way even editors at the New York Times trying to make decisions of how to use that number. There's no way we can expect anyone to understand all the math behind it. And yet we boil it down to this really intoxicatingly simple number and put that out there.
How much do you think this is about also the ability of, like, there's a lot of been reported about this in trials and things like that. If you can present science, like the illusion of science to people, that numerous, like people's ill numeracy means that like they see a shiny number and that seems like certainty to them, something like clean and like that they can kind of glom onto. And I just wonder, like, this obsession over polls, not just, I mean, it's actually, I would say it was actually happening before Nate Silver, and like, obviously we've done polls forever, but the models and things like that, I think that it goes back to almost like a sabermetrics kind of thing that kind of started happening in like the 90s. But there's just been this, I feel like people are so obsessed with the poll numbers, and I've never been one of those people, and I'm like, am I missing something? Is this something that I should be paying more attention to? And I mean, you are a person who deals with those numbers, and after what you observed in the 2016 election, have you changed your mind?
I've definitely changed my mind about forecasting. Obviously, having contributed to that enterprise in 2016 and having it go terribly. I could make the argument that what happened was a 2% chance. Yes, it was only 80,000 votes, but there's no point in making that argument. I think forecasting has the potential to do more harm, and I don't see the public good in it. With regular polls, I do think the horse race is way too harped on, and there's much more interesting things. There are almost always way more interesting questions in any given poll than that horse race number. The thing we have to remember there is, like with the forecast, so the forecast 72% is not just one number. The same principle kind of applies to the polls. We have a margin of error on that poll, and that's an uncertainty measure.
And all of the harm of self-reporting.
Yeah, and making it even worse, we don't know who's going to vote. We're pretending that we have a population of voters that we don't even have yet. So we can't sample from that. So it becomes an art form to try to figure out the likely voters and even create those measures. So I would honestly prefer pollsters release multiple estimates and say, here's what we think if turnout looks like it did in 2016. Here's what would happen if turnout looks like it did in 2018. We just don't know what the target is. And especially this year with the pandemic and vote by mail and the post office, we have no idea what turnout is going to look like or whose votes are going to get counted.
So help me out. If Nate Silver were here, and he didn't respond to my tweet, so you get to like say anything about him that you want. He, I think, would say you're overreacting. Your model wildly overstated Trump's chances of defeat. Mine didn't. Mine gave him a 29% chance, and so you're concluding from your own error that the enterprise is bad, but I who made, I guess, 15 times less of that error, or only 1/15 of that error, really don't feel the same concern about the enterprise. And so I guess my question is, as somebody who's a little bit skeptical of the enterprise myself, but nonetheless follows it kind of carefully because I think it's an interesting little project, why are you overinterpreting the problem based on your own experience? Why not conclude from that Nate's model was better than yours?
So a couple of things there. I think that's exactly what Nate would say. And he said repeatedly in 2016 that his model was better than mine, although he never actually called me by name. I think this gets to another kind of piece of what I talk about in the article is you have kind of two pathways when you're setting up these models. You can either try to stick with the data, or you can try to inject a lot of uncertainty into it. Now, clearly, you probably want to put more uncertainty in it. But prior to 2016, when we didn't have that lesson, there was a real argument to be made for sticking as close to the data as possible. And if you stick as close to the data as possible, this is what I outline in the article. We just have so many sources of error in polls that we can't account for, that we literally can't quantify, that we end up being overly certain. We end up underestimating uncertainty. And so that's where I fell on that side, where I was trying not to make subjective decisions. I was trying to stick as close to the data as possible, which is kind of the line that The Economist is taking this year as well. And So I would not necessarily argue that that's a better model. In the end, we have no idea what the chance was that Donald Trump would win.
Right.
Nobody can say with any certainty this
we
model.
know that there was 100% chance that he did win.
Exactly.
And that nobody knew that until the moment that it happened.
Right. And so the one thing that I would kind of point to as a key example of this is in Nate Silver's model that he just put out, there is an uncertainty index that he uses to model the uncertainty. It's really interesting. There are only 2 places. It has 8 things. It's an itemized list. You can go look at it in their methodology. There are 2 things that I have qualms with. One is that he's using congressional measures of polarization to talk about the mass public. But okay, they're probably correlated. The one I'm really confused by is he's using the number of full-length New York Times headlines as a measure of uncertainty, with the argument that more full headlines about the election equals more uncertainty. And if you are looking at this on the methodology, part of that sentence links out to another page. So you follow the link and you expect to see some justification of this argument. That link goes to a tweet that's a screenshot of data output showing the distribution of New York Times full headlines by year.
Huh.
And so I pushed on him a little bit on Twitter and ended up provoking another spat between him and Elliot. My Twitter mentions were quite fun for a while. But we never got an answer of what the justification is for more New York Times headlines or full-length New York Times headlines equaling more uncertainty. All we know is that there are way more of them this year than there ever have been before, which to me says that's kind of something you're using to create extra uncertainty that I don't think a lot of people would necessarily choose to do.
So that's interesting. Would you feel better about it if he just had a variable for Nate's sense of uncertainty?
Yeah.
That then if you asked him about it and it would be like, I don't know, things feel very fluid to me, so I'm on a scale of 1 to 10 putting the uncertainty index at 4.5. Mm-hmm. And that would be a kind of building into the model a little bit of a kind of impressionistic instinct.
That actually would make me feel better because it would say, I am injecting my opinion and be honest about that rather than trying to hide behind some form of data that you've constructed that is data, but there's no clear theory behind it. This is where my training as a political scientist kicks in, and I'm like, what's the theory here? Why do these headlines matter? So I actually would.
Was that? Do you think it was related in any way to the fact that he's at the New York Times? You don't think that's like something?
He isn't
like that
anymore.
Yeah, but that he was. I don't know. It just seems like a very strange thing. Like, why not Blue Paper Daily? Like, or our Huffington Post, or like a mix of headlines. That just isn't. I don't know. It doesn't parse particularly well for me.
Yeah. I really want to know more about this particular aspect, and unfortunately, we haven't gotten that.
All right, so let's talk about the N too, because the N here has bothered me since the beginning of the whole modeling enterprise. It seems to me where modeling makes the most sense is in a repeat game, something that you're doing over and over and over again. The stock market, the commodities markets, right? Where you can play it over and over and over again, and you can compare the performance of one model to another by, say, buying commodities, right? And this this model, after watching the market over X number of years involving X number of tens of millions of trades, tells you buy pork bellies now, and you make more money if you follow market model 1 than if you follow model 2. Nate comes out of the sports betting business, and the sports prediction business, which is not quite that refined, but you do have in baseball 162 games a year, and each batter faces each pitcher a bunch of times, right? You have these repeat games, and so you end up generating a shitload of data. And it's a shitload of relatively controlled, relatively predictable data that actually has defined meaning. As in, a single is a single, a home run is a home run, right? Here, you have an N of 20 elections. And by the way, most of them aren't real, because they're elections that involve predicting things that have already happened. Predicting the past is relatively easy thing to do. And, it's a fairly good predictor based on one variable, the taller candidate wins, right? And so, if the goal is to predict things that have already happened, it is fairly easy to build a model to do that. It's much harder when you turn that model on the future. And so the number of models that have the N of repeat games in the future is very small. And so my question is, why doesn't that itself render the enterprise a sort of disreputable, like you're creating a data-tuned model to predict things that have already happened that will then come out and say you have a 72% chance of a Biden victory, which is itself amenable to any result will prove it right. It's a little less true if it's a 98% chance, but at 72% chance anything will prove it right. And so my question is, what good is it? And isn't it actually like it comes back to this faux precision point?
Mm-hmm. So I want to come back. There's actually a comment that I just saw fly across the screen that is part of this answer. There's a huge use for this within campaigns. They can build predictive models to show who's likely to vote for them, who they need to go out and target. These things can be really powerful as campaign tools. And I don't really even fault political scientists who go out and develop theory and create these models. That's been an industry for decades. Nate Silver wasn't the first one to think of, hey, let me try to predict an election. Political scientists have been doing this forever. They just do it kind of within their own boundaries and use it as kind of a theory building exercise. Where I struggle is exactly that last question you posed. What is the public good of putting this thing out there? And that's where I personally could not come up with a good answer. What does it give people that they don't already have? Well, it lets them pretend that they can know the future. Humans like to do that. It's part of the human condition. We hate uncertainty. But in that it could give us a false sense of the future, it becomes dangerous. So that's exactly where I struggle, is that question of what's the public good, other than making the media organizations that they work for a lot of money off of clicks. What's the public service?
So this is kind of blends together a bunch of things that we're talking about, but to kind of bring it back to kind of the baseball metaphor that Ben was using and referencing kind of Nate's background in. I would actually, and what we call the horse race kind of analogy, like horse races are like, you have one horse over time that like performs X well, and you kind of can like know in certain conditions how it performs. Like it's like a little bit there. The world of variables is comparatively small to all of these people on a field against all of these other people on a field, and like everything else that's happening that given day. But the beauty of sabermetrics and the beauty of some of this stuff was that it figured out, this is exactly to your point about campaigns, was that actually just kind of found a way to maximize the building of a team based on one reliable indicator of success when matched with another reliable indicator of success. So like, for example, if you had a really great like stolen base record, that like, but you were had a crappy batting average, put at the right place at the right time, that was an incredible boon, and you could build a team around those pieces instead of just kind of always looking for A+ across the board players. This is to your point, I guess, about maybe some of what these models are good for is for campaigns to build out that's the level of certainty that they can respond to, not an outcome certainty, because sabermetrics never like tried to like predict the outcome of a baseball game. It was just about creating a good team over time. So I think that's I think it's actually a very good way of kind of threading the needle about like where these are tremendously useful and like who these can be. But I think that what you said is correct, that people don't want uncertainty and are just thirsty for anything that can give them some level of that going into the election. With that being said, do you think that all of the models are a little bit hedged in their betting this year compared to 2016 after everything that happened?
I think silver is very hedged, which is understandable. Like I said, you have two options when you're building these models. You can either stick to the data, or you can, go after building uncertainty. I'm less so in comparison. Kind of the only way to look at these really is in comparison. The two major models we have, The Economist and 538, they're predicting mostly the same popular vote, and yet one has 72% and one has, I'm not sure what The Economist was at today. It's 89%. Was either yesterday or this morning. But the popular vote estimates are basically the same. So clearly you have a disconnect between how they're measuring the uncertainty. I don't know, I certainly think that the Economist team is being extremely thoughtful and extremely rigorous in how they're approaching it. But that goes back to the argument that I made in my article. We literally can't measure most of these sources of uncertainty. So if you're trying to be rigorous and trying to stick to the data, you might well be underestimating.
Isn't I'm just trying to translate your point into a single sentence, which is, if you were designing a model today, it would look more like Elliott's than like Nate's. If you were being faithful to the data, and yet you don't believe that Trump has a 93% chance of losing, which is another way of saying that you've lost confidence in our ability to assess the degree of uncertainty. And so you're hedging, Nate's hedging by building the uncertainty into the model in a way that you find a little bit less than entirely honest. And you're hedging by saying, I don't really have confidence in this enterprise anymore.
To some degree, yeah. I think I would put it slightly differently, though. We will never know if Trump's win was a result of a 2% chance or a 28% chance. It was roughly the difference between my model and Nate's model. We'll never know that. So to unequivocally say that one was right and one was wrong is also incorrect. So
turns out that's a binary.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No,
I know,
that's
it's
where
a dorky joke.
that's where I get kind of tripped up is, okay, these models might be real, but we'll never know on November, in some of their spats I've seen Elliot just say to Nate, I guess we'll talk on November 4th. But on November 4th, we won't know
Right.
if today Trump's chances were 7% or 28%.
Well, and also those models are going to converge to some degree, as Elliot
Mm-hmm.
conceded in our conversation. And so, at the end of the day, they're going to both predict a very high likelihood of the same thing happening. And if that thing happens, they'll both be able to claim that's because their model was great. And if that thing doesn't happen, it will be an irresolvable conflict whether that happened because of the part under the part of the probability that they both allowed, or whether it was in the marginal probability that Elliot didn't allow and Nate did.
Right.
So I want to turn to the defense of the modeling, for which I have some sympathy. Which is that, so I come out of the world of, normal old journalism as opposed to data journalism. And Nate Silver is not wrong that the world of pre-data journalism punditry was a series of almost uniformly pompous male self-described experts pontificating based on a gut instinct and no data. And they were usually right because the conventional wisdom is usually right. But there was no, Nate did bring a lot of disciplined thinking to the enterprise of how to think about horse races. And the answer, well, we should all think about horse races less, is true, I suppose, but it's not adequate because we actually spend a lot of time thinking about horse races, and it's a little bit like telling a heroin addict that, just stop taking heroin, and so my question is, if you're gonna, aren't the models playing an important role in exactly the way you described of what are they saying to the New York Times editors? It seems to me the basic message that Nate Silver has said to the New York Times editors is, don't fall too much in love with your conventional wisdom that Trump is in a tailspin. He can still win. And and that's probably a healthy message for political journalists who just want to interview the same 10 people at the same diner in New Hampshire in January, and then decide they know what's going to happen in the election because those people said, or they talked to their cab driver. And so my question is, with all its flaws, isn't it playing a useful role?
The first thing I'll say is that the only thing that's changed from your description of the before times to now is that we've added data.
Is that we've added data? Yeah, but that's a pretty big thing.
It's still largely pompous white men saying that they are right and everyone else is wrong.
Right, but you can't address all the problems at once.
I just have to point out that the only thing that's changed
I'm agreeing with you.
is we have data. Now, is that a substantial addition? Absolutely. That's great. Data is better than no data. At the same time, I would argue that many of the things that Nate dismisses are equally rigorous to what he's doing. For example, the handicappers. Cook and Crystal Ball, they're taking qualitative and quantitative indicators and making a qualitative decision. Now, that can go dramatically wrong. You know, we have the Lightman 13 keys model that's just not worth anyone's time. But you know, there is a way to bring rigor with and without data. I do think Nate brought in a good dose of thinking, and I do think the infusion of data is good. I don't think the squabbling about whose model can beat up whose model is helpful to anyone or any enterprise on this planet.
That's really well said. Yeah, I think that's right.
What do you think about averaging polls? So this is
That's a great question.
The crudest kind of model it's not even a model really. It's just a way of getting rid of some of the weight on individual polls. Just say, throw it all together, sort of real clear politics, just average it. And is that a useful undertaking?
So yeah, poll aggregation is actually something I still think is a very useful enterprise. I think polls differ so frequently in their construction and how they're done that it can be really confusing for a layperson to look at a poll that says Biden is up 51-49 and a poll that says Biden is up 53-42 and figure out what the difference is and why there is a difference. So where poll aggregation comes in, when it's done well and when it correctly shows you know, the margins of error and the uncertainty that you still have even with an aggregate, having one place to go that shows you kind of, okay, as a big picture, here's what the polls are showing, I think is really valuable. Where I think it goes astray, just to be clear, I think it goes astray when we start talking about the probability of an outcome. You know, if we keep the frame that the polls are what's happening now, you know, I think aggregation can be a really useful thing.
I would say if you had to pick between a model and a poll aggregator as a predictor of outcome, one or the other, can't say no. What would you pick?
Well, so essentially, I will answer the question, I promise. Essentially, along the way, the forecasts are poll aggregators.
Right.
So what you're seeing, and The Economist actually shows this really nicely in their visualization. They have an estimate of what the poll aggregation says the popular vote looks like today, and then they extrapolate that out to November. So that would be my preference, would be The Economist style. Here's what it says today. Here's how we extrapolate that out. I would skip the probability and just look at that one graph that they have that's the timeline of the popular vote estimates.
David Batt, the floor is yours. We got your name right today.
Hey.
Well, thank you so much.
Hey. Hi, David.
And hi,
But you'll always be Dan on this show.
Hey.
well, so that's high praise, so I appreciate that. So maybe I can get a twofer in. So really appreciate the discussion. As a general matter, many or most people simply do not understand statistics and probability. What are some analogies that you would suggest for helping people understand that low probability events can still happen? And then if you want to talk a little bit about how do you deal with people who do not answer the phones? I don't answer my phone. If I don't know who it is, I don't answer. Thank you.
Sure. So I should have written down. I've already blanked on the first question. So
The first question was about. Oh wait.
No, I remember. what the first question was about. The first question was about, see, this is why we have the list of questions. People just don't understand statistics and probability.
Oh, that's right.
Right.
And what are the tools we should be using to help people when we present probabilistic estimates have a chance of dealing with them?
Okay, yes. Thank you. So I think visualization is key. There's a ton of effort going into both The Economist and 538's visuals. I tend to like The Economist better, but I'm also I know the statistics, and so I fully admit that if you're not a statistics person, the way 538 is doing it with the ball pits and the heads floating around might actually work better for you. So I do think a lot of those things are good. If I was having a one-on-one conversation with someone who was like, please teach me about probability, I'd pull out a coin and just do a series of coin flips and write down, and it's 50% each time you flip it, but you can get 4 heads in a row. What was the probability of that happening? And I would literally walk through that if somebody was asking me to one-on-one do that explanation. Kind of turning to the question of people answering their phones. So polls are in an interesting technological moment. And this is one of the things I enjoy about my current job at PRRI is I do a lot of thinking about this kind of issue. How do we reach people to get their opinions? At PRRI, we do polls in a couple of ways. We do the phone calls. As Dave mentioned, the phone calls are hit and miss. Response rates are single digits, usually less than about 5% of people who you try to call actually answer your survey. So that's really low. We do a lot of work to try to make sure those are representative polls. But of course, with response rates that low, it's kind of difficult to be 100% certain. We also have a lot of internet poll methods running around. Some are better than others. Some are much more rigorous than others. There are polls that go out and recruit people offline and get them to join an online panel. Those are generally higher quality because they've tried to adjust for people that are not necessarily online. Generally, just kind of to wrap it into a larger picture statement, election polling in general is an amalgam of all different methods. Some are good, many are not. And so that's another point in favor of the aggregators is particularly ones that sort on the quality of the polls. You can get information that way and not have to worry about all of these methodological things that get very microscopic very fast.
So I've been trying to bring in Chris for a question, but I have been failing at it utterly. So let me try again. If I am unsuccessful again, I will just read his questions.
There's a bunch of them.
Yes. And they are interesting and thoughtful.
Yeah, they're very good.
Well, I have not been able to get him in, so I'm just going to read them. Chris asks, at the... sorry, let me find that. This is, at the risk of overfitting, isn't it good to find objective measures? What? Sorry, I'm now having trouble with...
Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, please.
So I'll start with the first one, which is, how well does any forecasting method handle the factors not seen before? for in modern U.S. history, such as the U.S. Postal Service sabotage, state legislatures disregarding voting and picking slates, or outright refusal to observe or allow results, etc. And then he kind of like puts the London bookmakers 538 or economist models or super forecasters. And so that's like, just to summarize, the question there is, how does like any forecasting model deal with these randomized kind of events that have like never happened before, basically? And then his other question is,
let's start with that.
okay, sure.
So the
Black
short,
swans.
the short answer, I would say, is that they can't. This is probably why you see the insertion of some random sources of uncertainty. That's because we literally have no way to quantify what could happen, what's happening. You know, everything is ticking along. And I believe Nate has made this point that his forecast is assuming that the election goes off as planned, because there really isn't a way to account for what's going on with the Postal Service or any vote suppression type of activities.
But that seems to me to be a very good argument for having a basic, like, Nate and Natalie's sense of how much chaos and entropy is in the air variable, where the organizers kind of basically get together and say, hey, we think things are on a very stable track, and the person who's in the White House is a pretty normal human being, call him Barack Obama, and the person running against him is a pretty normal human being, call him Mitt Romney. Neither of them is going to spaz out and do anything insane, and the economy is chugging along at the same rate that it's been for a while, and there's no incipient international crises on the horizon bubbling along. We'll set the stability factor to the entropy factor of a 2.5 on a scale of 1 to 10. By contrast, now you have a crazed psycho in the White House, you have a global pandemic, you have promises of voter suppression, like active promises of voter suppression, and you have an economic disaster. You might save, and we keep trying to, pick a war with Iran, and so you might set, I think like reasonable people could say, okay, the uncertainty level is sort of 7.5 or 6 or whatever. But I'm totally sympathetic to doing that. I just don't believe that there's a like that seems to me to be the way to build in the uncertainty about whether the post office is going to have the capacity to to deliver a whole lot of ballots.
If I had to quantify it and had access to a regularly running survey, what I would do is ask the public, how likely do you think it is that this will happen? And that would be my uncertainty factor.
So you ask, like, how uncertain do you feel about stuff over the next 3 months? Mm-hmm. And you just build. That's an elegant.
That is an elegant way to do it.
I that.
I would say, but to Ben's point,
Nate, if you're listening, in addition to getting those 30,000 missing emails, Russia, build in an uncertainty question and to your polls. There you go.
Well, the thing is, Nate doesn't actually run polls, but if he did, he could do this.
No, but I mean, somebody will do it, and then he can build it into the model.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's talk about what you're doing now. Because now you've left this world of modeling, and you've in fact left election polling, and you're doing actual public opinion research. So how does it feel?
So what I'm doing now is more in line with kind of what I did my graduate school work on, what I wrote my dissertation on. I worked on how people think. What really gets me going is, how do people think about politics? How do people think about these big issues in society? What makes them decide that this is my opinion? And a lot of it boils down to partisanship, but there is a segment of people for whom partisanship is not their main thing. So really kind of the election thing was a pathway that was interesting and a good opportunity that I took advantage of, but it was away from my real intellectual curiosities. And so that's where I've come back around. And PRI has a history of doing great work on particularly how religion fits in with politics and race to kind of define our society. And so it's a really good spot for me to think about those things, to think about how we even ask people what their opinions are, and to just what makes people tick. That's what I've always wanted to know.
Has the harassment stopped?
For the most part, yes.
Good.
I still get a troll every now and then.
Mm-hmm. So I saw an awful trolling, just really mean trolling incident last night. Maybe it was this morning. Can't remember. It was last night. And I noticed that the troller also followed me. This was somebody who was writing very mean things about a young woman and her children, which like the latter of which kind of pushed it over the edge for me. And so I wrote this troll, who was herself female, a note that, hey, that's really mean shit you're saying. It's pretty tough to be like in the public debate, and it's probably tougher if you're a young woman with children. And she wrote me back within like 30 seconds the most astonishingly mean note I have gotten in a long time. And
really?
It blamed me for Bill Barr's being Attorney General, and told me to go fuck myself, and told me I was responsible for the entire environment that we're in. And I was like pretty taken aback by it. I mean, to be fair, I did start the fight, so I don't want I don't want to claim innocence. I was like being a imperious, nosy person telling her to lay off the trolling, but I was surprised at how nasty she was.
We talk about this a lot, by the way, like trolling and like everything, like just. It's some of what I've studied in the past. And
Kate's
Ben
one of the world's authorities on trolling.
Because I live with John Shea. But no, seriously. But Ben has experienced a ton of it, much more than I have. I just have been fascinated with it, probably in the same way that you have, because I'm just kind of fascinated by what would make people come after people like this in a way that they probably wouldn't in real life, but they get this shield of the anonymity of the internet, and they hide behind it, and they say it to Ben in 30 seconds, but they probably would never sign their real name to. I don't know.
Well, no, this person's real name is on I think her real name is on the tweets, and they're
now I'm gonna go look it up.
Unbelievably mean about I mean, the person is a relatively prominent young opinion writer who nothing about what she has ever written warrants the kind of abuse this person. I mean, it's not at the level of disagreement. It's at the level of really mean personal harangue about who she is, and I was amazed by it, and so I just sent her a little note saying, that's really mean. And I was, even knowing who she was, or knowing what she'd said about this other person, I was a little bit surprised at the vehemence of her reaction to me.
But you're right. Also, it does happen in a different way to women than men.
Yes,
And that
absolutely.
what you experienced was like something that we've seen across the board, and like it's been kind of shown. So we're sorry you went through that, without a doubt.
And thank you for coming on the show and braving whatever nastiness gets thrown your way as a result of taking on the sainted Nate Silver, who is, of course, invited on the show to defend his model and answer the question, why not just have a Nate's uncertainty index variable instead?
That is Natalie's index.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, you can have my idea.
Yeah,
And for,
I mean,
for what it's worth, I do want to say that I fully respect Nate's intellect, and I think he is doing what he indeed thinks is right. We just have some differences of opinions on these things.
no, I am merely stoking controversy where and discord where there exists, as far as I can tell, only polite disagreement. Although I want to say some of the spatting between him and Elliot seems a little bit more in the department of WWF.
E.
Is it E or F?
It's E now because the World Wildlife Federation took it back.
Oh, I see. Okay. So it seems more like the World Wrestling Federation.
Entertainment.
Kind of my model can beat up your model kind of stuff. So thank you for coming on the show. Tomorrow it is just Kate and me and my lousy internet connection at the cabin in the woods. We will, we need to do a poll. And
Oh, yeah.
with Natalie as the guest, we
You have to
certainly
ask
need
the
to do a
poll.
poll. And I know exactly what the poll should be.
Oh. Well, that's
I
good. You took her off
trust-
the hook.
Election forecast models, colon, a great deal, somewhat, very little, not at all, and finally, very little or not at all, but I look at them religiously anyway.
Yep.
I think that's an important.
Okay, I'm going to take it.
People are being honest.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty good.
See, and if that's the approach, I have no problem with that. My goal is just to insert these thoughts into the conversation writ large.
Yeah, if you treat them as entertainment,
Yeah.
like gambling.
Yes, MDY says that last bit is like horoscopes.
Yeah.
And there's something
exactly
to that.
right.
So, on that cheerful note, we are going to sign off. Tomorrow it is just us. Natalie, come back anytime. This was great fun.
It was. Thank you.
And we will be back 22 hours and 57 minutes from now. And until then, we don't have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, you can at least consult election forecasts that you don't have confidence in.
I was going to say, at least we have horoscopes.
Yeah, exactly. See you tomorrow, everyone.
Bye, guys.